Hey and welcome to this video. If it's your first time here, my name is Lachlan Rowson.
I'm Raf.
And we are Australia's #1 health and fitness podcast, The Mind Muscle Project. So, if you're here, what you can expect from us in the future is...
Well, we interview the biggest names in fitness. On Mondays, we've had Matt Fraser, Brent Fikowski, Pat Vellner, pretty much all the boys.
On Wednesdays, we talk about our athletic experience in our mid to early 20s. We've been to regionals multiple times. We talk about the most current and the most exciting new stuff in our industry.
And on Fridays, on the podcast, we delve into fitness business. So we've started 3 gyms ourselves, and we talk about where we want to go with them, how we're doing it, and how to succeed in the fitness industry.
So if you want to see more from us in the future, more exciting content, interviews, we've got heaps of stuff. You can go to the links below. We've got our website. We've got the top 10 most downloaded podcasts of all time. You guys will really enjoy those. And we've got plenty more content on our Instagram, so go there as well. And if you like videos, subscribe to the YouTube channel down below.
Sorry, is block, just quickly, is block like doing hypertrophy and then doing strength?
Yeah, and then moving into strength work and then moving into like peaking work.
Just like 2 months at a time.
Yeah, or like in endurance sports, they used to do is like you have your 5 months of doing aerobic base work, and now you're doing your high intensity work, and now you're doing your peaking work. I've used that with athletes in the past. It doesn't fucking work. Like, you might get some residual gains because you're working hard, but if you really pay attention to what like the best coaches in specific sports are doing and really try and model it, you could understand why that doesn't work, because that's just not how our bodies work.
Let's be clear. Evan says it doesn't work. It does work. It does create the desired adaptation of improving someone in the sport versus where they were before, but it's not the optimal way to improve someone in the sport.
Yeah, and I think that piggybacks on that's just not how... Whoa.
We're good.
Are we good?
Yeah.
Good save.
That's why we can't have nice things. So, that's where I think, like, looking at actual biology, and I think, like, 2 years ago or so when I was here, I started reading, like, a bunch of books from random fields, and one of the ones that I read was this book on, like, environmental biology, which was just really fucking random. I don't even really like that topic that much. But I started reading it, and everything in there, it was basically about the environment and how it kind of self-corrects itself, and I started looking into more of that literature and physiology in different fields, and I realized the same principles really do apply to our bodies. Like in that book, they were talking about how in nature, like everything must go somewhere. Like if something happens here, then it's going to have a chain reaction here, or like there's no such thing as a free lunch in nature.
Yeah, like the concept of the butterfly flaps its wings and,
exactly.
And, you know, the typhoon happens. Right?
When we started talking about that and doing more research and getting more like contemporary models of adaptation, not from the field of exercise physiology, from other fields that were on the cutting edge there, like molecular bio, you could kind of even come up with a bullet-pointed list of why those supercompensation models don't really make sense, and then you could start to form an alternative of what works better. And again, like Kyle said, I definitely talking a little bit more extremes where I'm like, it doesn't work. That's obviously an extreme example, because back in the 1950s, Roger Bannister ran a sub 4-minute mile by going on walks like 3 days a week.
Yeah.
So anything works to an extent, but I really don't think that's the best way to do things. And if we're trying to develop athletes to the highest level, well, why are we going to waste our time and energy on things that don't directly bring us closer to the goal? We want to be surgical, because ultimately we want to do as little work as possible to get there, not have an athlete train 30 hours a week when maybe 15 of those training hours were actually relevant to what they need to be doing.
So that's interesting, because we see a lot of athletes do way too much training, and it makes me think that there's like this threshold that if you cross over, the athlete stops adapting at all, really.
Yeah, they run out of adaptation currency. That's a good way to think about it.
Yeah. Do you guys think that that's like legit? Do you think that's true? Have you seen it happen?
Absolutely. Yeah. I can't tell you how many times I've taken on like bubble level regional athletes where they'll send me their training volume, and I'll look at it and I'm like, holy shit, like they're doing so much work. And I'll even have a conversation with them. I'm like, look, I think you should be doing like 30-40% of what you're doing.
Well, specifically, are you talking like 4 or 5 hours a day? Like, is that like holy shit?
Yeah, and I'll often tell them, like, they never want to do that because from their mind that's a hard sell. But I'll usually tell them, like, give me 6 months and just follow exactly what I say. And if you don't get better, I'll program whatever the fuck you want. You could tell me how many hours you wanted trained per day. You could create your entire training split and skeleton, and I'll just fill in the details for you, and we could make that happen. But inevitably, like, the first 2 months, they usually feel pretty flat and, like, lethargic, and they're like, I just feel like shit.
Why is that?
It's because when they're in the state that they came in on, they have stress hormones circulating all of the time. So they're basically running on fumes.
Right.
And when athletes are in like somewhat overtraining phases, they usually feel fucking great because you have stress hormones going all the time. And that's why sometimes you'll give an athlete a deload week and they'll feel like complete crap during the deload. They're like, I feel so sluggish and like I feel tired and I just want to do more training. If that's happening to the athlete, that means they're probably in a chronically overreaching phase, and it takes a few months to really like self-correct that. But when you do, then athletes get to the point where they could adapt on pretty little work. If you look at an athlete like Noah, for example, where the dude, you could give him like 20 different types of training and he adapts well to everything. Everyone's body has an innate adaptive potential. Obviously, he's an extreme example. Like Kyle said, adaptation currency.
He has
if
a lot.
Noah's like a millionaire in adaptation currency, maybe I have like $55. But that being said, like most people are blowing $55 every day of the week and they're going into debt.
In their AM session of Monday.
Yeah, exactly. So what you could do better, like if you could really pull someone's volume back, get them to the point where their health is optimized, because there's so many underlying things that if you just fix the holes inside their body, not literally, yes, they have like leaky gut, which
that would be something that you could address.
Then you have holes, those could be plugged.
Yeah.
I was just about to say something fucking weird, but I'm not gonna say it.
Evan, I'm gonna piggyback off that a little bit.
I'm gonna fill in the weird shit for you.
Evan, we're gonna switch just a little bit. One thing I think that is important to keep in mind is that when you look at the athletes that have been successful in the past, you might say, man, Froning, he followed this really high volume training program and he had great results. Yes, that's absolutely true. For Rich, that was his method for getting to the top of the sport and winning multiple championships. But if you look, most of the people that follow really high training volumes, really high volume programs, they're not successful in the sport. You have your outliers. You have some that follow really high training volume programs and they're successful. But the vast majority of those people are just, sitting at home watching regionals on the live stream.
Well, they're in the gym training, really.
Yeah. Or they're in the gym with it. You're right. They're not sitting at home watching the live stream.
They're on the assault bike.
They're on the assault bike watching the live stream. What that shows is that when you have to use a high volume training program in order to elicit adaptation, what you're really doing is you're throwing as much stuff at the wall, as much shit at the wall as possible, and seeing what sticks. And there will be some athletes who have $1 million adaptation currency, like Noah and like Rich and like Matt, who will continue to get better as a result of that. And you will have 100,000 more who don't. And what that shows is that if your program requires you to have really high volumes of training to get people to adapt, then you don't really know what things are making the athlete adapt. Like you're missing out on the most potent components of training. If that's what's required, then it shows a lack of understanding of what you should be doing.
And if you do go too high too soon too, like if you're not adapting to that, where do you go next? Like there is no next logical step, because you're like, well, say I'm doing 100 units of training volume and 50 is their optimal. It's like, well, it leads to the illusion of like, maybe I should do 125 and I'll get better versus like, I'm going to cut down to 50. So I think always starting an athlete with less than you think they need is probably the best way to go, because then you could take the next logical step and add more. But if you're already doing a ton, you've almost like sunk the boat in. You need to like build a new boat entirely to even get where you want to go.
Training volume is a great tool. I want to be clear here. Like, using high volume periods of training is a great tool for getting athletes to adapt. It's great for learning new movements and getting exposure to the vast variety of stuff that you have to deal with in CrossFit. And for a games athlete, like, let's face it, you're gonna have to run and carry sandbags and do all this other, potentially paddleboard and all these different things, right, that you wouldn't normally get exposure to unless you're doing really high volume training. So it is a tool that has to be used, but it's not a tool that needs to be used for everybody to get them from point A, which is 1,000th in the open, to the top 20. In fact, for most people, it won't work.
And I was going to say, for those athletes, wouldn't you just make the argument that high volume approach, at the end of the day, it's all relative, but that's just the right amount of volume for that athlete in that exact scenario. I think where people get into the wrong path in this sport is that people just want to do volume for the sake of doing volume without a
Absolutely.
purpose. Like, if you look at a sport like running, I personally know sub 4-minute milers that run 40 miles a week, and I know sub 4-minute milers that run 120 miles per week, and they have the exact same times. The 120-mile athlete, or the 40-mile athlete, isn't wishing that they could run 120 miles a week and run the same exact times that they're running. They're like damn happy that they don't need to spend how many hours. But in CrossFit, an athlete could be doing like 5 sessions a week and making good progress. And I've even had like regional level athletes where we've done that, and they like keep getting better, but they want to do more. And when we have them up their sessions, they stop progressing or they do worse. But they're still reticent to go back to 5, even though that's what works for them. Like, they want to do more and be these high volume athletes, even if that's not what they need. And I think that's just like a disconnect in this sport for whatever reason, is like people just want to be that guy that trains 20 times a week. Yeah, ego, or like maybe...
I think it's just social proof. That's what they've seen that the champions have done. And so they think that in order to... They're trying to reverse engineer what the best have done to themselves, when that's not... they're not the best. They don't have that physiology. They don't have that anatomy. They might have a different cardiac system. They might have a different respiratory system. They have a different physiological limiter. So doing the same thing that someone else did is not going to get you the same result.
Yeah, we had...
Period.
We had Mike Israel on, but he was on another podcast I was listening to him say that what a lot of people also haven't considered is quite a lot of these athletes who have come from extensive training backgrounds of suffering. Obviously training CrossFit for 30 hours a week is a lot of suffering. It is for them therapy. And if you probably ask them about their past, there's probably some dark shit in there, whether it's to do with, social circles or parents or relationships falling apart and that sort of thing. And, being able to just suffer for 5, 6, 7 hours a day is their therapy, right? And so they're just doing it to just numb their mind and their emotions.
That's what I was talking about at the beginning of the podcast, finding meaning in suffering.
Right.
So this is a suffering that can provide meaning because it has a direction, right? CrossFit itself, well, not CrossFit itself, because a group class tends to be something that's not, I would say it's not suffering because it's enjoyable, because it's a social setting, but training for a sport tends to be less enjoyable and more of a suffering experience, especially 30 hours plus a week of training for a sport like CrossFit. It allows them to suffer and have a purpose or meaning to that suffering.
And I was going to say, like, CrossFit, if you look at it as a sport and like what kinds of activities you're doing in that training, like, it's an extremely like dopaminergic activity. Like, that type of training drives your dopamine levels pretty high, and people get addicted to that shit. So it's like you want to keep doing it despite the fact that all the evidence says you're not going to get better if you keep doing this. And I think you see that in like ultra endurance sports too. Like, I've worked with a few athletes in that sport, and you look at their background. Some of them were like drug addicts or heroin addicts, and after they get off the drugs, they start running 100+ miles a week, and they're just feeding into the same kind of addiction.
Yeah.
Did you really just drop dopaminergic?
I just dropped
Dopaminergic.
dopaminergic.
There you go.
I've
Yeah.
learned like 9 words on this podcast.
That you never heard of before?
Never heard of.
I'm just going to start making up words, dropping them, and you're going to use it in a podcast in like 2
in the
months.
future. This guy Evan said this. That's 100%. It's the same. I mean, it's the same pathway for like what we're talking about: social media addiction, for checking your phone, for checking notifications, for like having that social anxiety, right? And we've seen people like in their deload weeks, that athletes that we've been surrounded by, you're talking about with the stress hormone and thing as well, but they're also, from the addictive standpoint, not having anything to do creates depression, creates anxiety. They walk around, they're slumped, they're bored, like their whole mood is different, and it's part stress hormone, but I feel like it's also part depression, because they're not feeding that addiction.
Their self-concept is completely wrapped up in training. They are, I am an athlete, even if they're not necessarily an athlete by the definition that, we would use to define an athlete.
Sure.
Their training is their self-identity. So if they're on a week where they don't have training, or they get injured, right? That's where you see it the worst. They get a back injury that prevents them from basically doing just about anything. Man, the fall from their high of training to the low is it's sometimes hard to watch if it's one of your athletes.
Tragic,
It really is. And I think a lot of that is because people's self-concept is so tied up into it that the only place that they find meaning in their life is through the gym. and everything else that they do, they don't really have anything else outside of that provides them with meaning.
Well, the insidious part too, like if you look at a sport like CrossFit, or even track and field, I know we've talked about this example, is a lot of the best athletes in these sports where you do talk to them, they're like super myopic and they're kind of like psychos in some ways.
Yeah.
That is characteristics of like a dopamine dominant brain state. Like you could take like a neurotransmitter profile test and see what your dominance is. So the same thing that leads some athletes to becoming this supreme winner, like this dominator, is also the thing that could lead them to that downfall, or lead athletes who are like subpar athletes into getting into those same destructive states. I know I think it was in the energy system course, the new variation, we had a section on like health principles that enhance athletic performance, and some of them were based around dopamine levels, like keeping your brain health safe in those ways that actually improve performance.
One of those things was deleting social media apps.
Instant gratification,
Right.
things of those nature.
Right. Yeah, it's one way I look at it, or I watch certain athletes that I know are much more heavily addicted to the high of training, is also how quickly it wears off after a workout. You almost see like, I will...
By the time we're finished, it's already worn off.
Yeah, like I will think, oh wow, that was such a good training session. I feel like I don't have to train for 3 or 4 days. It was so
Like,
good.
what's the finisher going to be?
Yeah, and they're up and they're like, it wasn't hard enough. Let's write something else. Or
We're
they
going to do an EMOM now.
Yeah. It's like, what's next? Like, keep feeding it over and over and over again.
But one thing to keep in mind is that some people that, like we talked about, the way that they adapt, their adaptation currency is just greater. And there are some people that are going to need to train with greater volume. So if you're a coach and you're listening to this, keep in mind that, you know, while some people it is a form of addiction, some people actually do need more training. I coach athletes who, you know, are regional or even, you know, games team athletes that they adapt really well to 3 sessions a day. 3 sessions that each one of them would be a full training day for me.
Yeah.
Right? Like each session is almost like 3 parts. And that would absolutely destroy me, and they handled that with no problem.
And that's just an individual thing,
5
right?
days a week.
And for them, that's the right amount of volume, though. You're
Exactly.
not doing it because they want to train more. You're doing it because you found, like, oh, this is actually what they need to adapt. Like, Travis and Noah aren't there training 5 hours a day because they want to be doing that. At this level in their career, that's just what they need. If they go in and do, like, a session that, like, you might do or I might do.
You can detrain yourself to make it so they could detrain themselves to make it so they could get adaptation out of 1 hour of training. I did that.
But you'd also had like a 20-year training career training like doubles prior to that.
Close to that, but not quite 20.
Yeah, it's a little bit of a different scenario.
That would have been 13. So actually, no, make it 19 years.
Yeah, I say Noah would have been like 7 years old if he was doing that.
Yeah, touche.
Yeah. We got sidetracked for like at least 30 minutes. We were talking about more of the principles of that don't work. Are we still in that? We got more?
Oh, yeah. So, I mean, if we actually look at some of those, I know we had mentioned it already, like supercompensation, a lot of those classical theories, they assume volume and intensity are the only things that influence training adaptation. And the reality is training or any of those inputs really just take place on, like, a chessboard of, like, biochemistry and our hormones and everything. And if you really look into those fields, there's something called the biopsychosocial model. Okay. So it's essentially saying everything in our body is an interplay of our biology. So that's our genetics, our hormones, our biochemistry, really like the food we're eating. Psycho, mental state, what's going on in our mind, our social interactions, our relationships. And then social, which feeds into like the environment as well. So that all is like the clusterfuck that determines what happens in training. So you could be doing everything perfect from a volume and intensity standpoint. Right. But if you just went through like a breakup or something, or you're going through a rough patch in your life, or even your environment's not that conducive to training, you're just not going to adapt optimally. Maybe you need way more training in that state, or you need less, but ultimately it determines, like, if you look at these classic schemes, like this week you do 5x5 at this percent, this week you do it at this percent, you add 5 sets. I think that's really just us trying to create some control and system that looks good on paper, but the reality is that's not how our bodies adapt. Maybe this week you do 5x5 at 320 pounds. Next week, if you want to do a progression, maybe your body would be like 4x3 at 320, and that's still going to get you the adaptation on paper. That's less volume and intensity, and you'd think that's a regression. But if that's what your body needs at that point, that's what you give it, and that's what you need to adapt. And that's where those autoregulated strength protocols that we talked about the other day come into play. It's finding what your body needs on that day and just giving it that, whether or not it's less than 2 weeks ago, because that need for control or things that look pretty on paper, ultimately they don't work as well, and they really don't matter.
So that concept really does inform the way that you should coach, especially if you're working with athletes. Again, people that are performance athletes. It should inform the way that you coach them. In that, we have the bio, right? So we're trying to improve their physiology, change the way that their body is actually structured, whether it's adding muscle tissue or changing tendon structure or building capillary density or changing their cardiac output. Like, that's the biology component. Right. But that's going to be influenced by the social. So the environment that they're training in, right? So are they training solo? Are they training with other people? That's going to influence the type of adaptation that they receive. And then the psycho, the mental aspect of it. Are they under stress? How are they putting their training into context? All of those things are rolled together and should inform your training. If you're trying to coach a high-level performer, you need to give them all of those things in doses. You need to give them training that's focused on where they're by themselves and they're just changing the way that their body functions. You need to give them training that's in an environment where it's a competitive environment. They have to deal with the social cues and are they winning? Are they losing? Teaching them to context losses, right? And then helping them develop a self-concept that's bigger than just the sport, because that is one of the things that we see almost always across the board leads people to better adaptation, to more positive adaptation types. So that model should be the basis of your coaching, right? For high level or performance-based athletes.
So the self-concept thing being that there are other things in your life. It's not just about who you are as an athlete. It's, your partners, your relationships, your career, all that sort of stuff.
Think about how many athletes. I know Michael Phelps has been one of the most vocal. After the Olympics, right, he spiraled into a massive state of depression, alcoholism, all that stuff.
The recent Olympics?
Not the most recent.
Oh, okay.
Before. He finally had a self-concept that was bigger than bigger than the sport or bigger than himself. He was competing for something that was bigger. If you look, there are so many. I think Matt Fraser talked about it after the first time that he won the CrossFit Games. When he walked back, there was like, maybe it was when he took runner up, but he walked back into the back and expected something, and there was nothing there. Like, he expected something to happen, and it wasn't there because at that time, and I would say it's probably not the case now, but his self-concept was so wrapped up into competing at that time that when he achieved whatever he was trying to achieve, which that year was a runner-up to Rich Froning, the letdown afterward, there was nothing there. There was no meaning.
Yeah. We talked about it with Khan recently, how he said that before, or when he qualified before, Khan Porter, Australian Games athlete, what, 4 times now?
Yeah, 4.
Yeah, he, for the first time going into competing, for him, it's like, it's not a selfish process anymore. It's about, what did he say it was about? It's about like influencing and showing other people that have like mental health issues that they can, train and be an example that, you can overcome these things and work hard and be a good example for like, your life can be, you're not going to lose your life to your mental health. Yeah.
Yes.
And you can, train, and he's going to set a good example for that. And he's like, whether I win or lose now, it's not really about that. It's about showing people that you can, put your mind to something and dedicate yourself towards something and achieve big things. It doesn't have to be CrossFit. For him it is, and that's what people see, but it can be anything.
When people are so wrapped up in the idea that they're an athlete and that their performance is what defines them, they become almost like hyper intensive on that. Like their only thought process is, I have to do this. And I feel like that's one of the things that actually leads people to fail, like get right up to where they want to go and then fall short.
I've seen that as well.
Yeah.
I don't know what it is. It's just
I think that there's a term in psychotherapy. They call it hyperintention, and I think they originally saw it in people who had erectile dysfunction. They would put so much pressure on themselves to perform, and their whole self-concept was wrapped up in performing for a woman, and then when it came time to do it, they couldn't.
Yeah.
And through psychotherapy, as soon as they got people to stop thinking about it constantly, obsessively, it all worked naturally. So when people are so wrapped up in the idea that they have to, I have to go to regionals, I have to qualify for the games, as soon as they you know, can get some distance from that and realize that their entire life is not wrapped up in that and reduce some of that hyperintention, then if they've done the training and they've done all the things that they needed to throughout the year, then it almost just happens for them.
Well, the problem is that because they believe it all year round, by the time it gets to that, it is their whole life.
Yep.
They put their career aside, they put relationships aside, they put all those things aside, so they don't set themselves up for when it's not there. And there's nothing for them to turn back when they're like, all right, well, maybe it's not everything. What else have I got? Nothing. That's when it's upsetting. All right, we'll get back to these principles. Okay, you said the main model.
So
what would be, have you got other stuff on why it doesn't work, or have you got new things?
So this ties into why it doesn't work and why we think there's a better model. But traditionally, when people look at training adaptation, let's say it's like a linear A to B. They're right here, and point B is over here, and there's 100 doors in front of them, and they do a training input, and they open a door, they get to another, and they keep stepping one step forward until they get there. In reality, that's not how adaptation works.
Yeah.
What adaptation really does, instead imagine someone standing in the middle of a giant circle, and around them there's like hundreds of doors that they have an option to open. Behind one of those doors is the training outcome that they want.
Okay.
So we're not pushing them towards that training outcome. What we're doing when we give them proper training principles and control all of these lifestyle variables is we're taking away other options.
Right.
So we could call those other doors like the degrees of freedom. These are all the things that their physiology could self-organize into. So let's say we give them like really good training. We're trying to get them stronger. And out of those 100 doors, we knock out 50. Those aren't options anymore. They have 50 left. Now they're sleeping, they're eating properly, we'll knock out another 20 doors. So now there's, I can't even do math.
30 doors.
There's 30 doors left. I was like, I don't remember how much I said in the other one. So same principles. Now, like, their social structure is good. They're in a good training environment. They're getting vitamin D. They have healthy mitochondria and all these things. And let's say we have 2 doors right now. One of them is that strength training goal that they want. The other one makes them better equipped to handle chronic stress. This athlete is always stressed. They're like dealing with extraneous bullshit from work. Well, why would their physiology self-organize and open that door that makes them stronger? That doesn't make them suited for the environment.
Right.
They open that other door and go to that. So what you're doing when you're controlling all of these training inputs, you're not actually pushing yourself towards one of these options. You're just limiting your other options and making it more likely that that will happen. At the end of the day, our physiology doesn't give a fuck if we could lift a heavier barbell or if we could win the CrossFit Games. What our bodies care about is that we're suited for our environment.
Right.
If you're training every day and that's a big part of your life, training becomes part of your environment. Your brain doesn't know that that doesn't matter. So that is something important that our body wants to adapt to make us better suited to survive, so to speak. But there's all these other inputs throughout the day too. You have like 20 hours that you're not training.
Depending on who you are, of course.
Depending on who you are. So if you could control all of those other variables and make it so that training is your primary environmental stressor, not some bullshit that you're thinking about from work all day and stressing about, you're going to make it so much more likely that that's the outcome you get, because that's ultimately how adaptation works. It's not a linear process. If you look at the science of it, it's called dynamic systems theory. And what it basically says is there's no set pattern of adaptation. There's not this like golden egg that you're chasing and trying to get. Everything in the way that your body adapts in every way, it's really just random self-organization. And there's millions of degrees of freedom that random process could self-organize into. So you just want to limit them as much as you can if you're trying to get a specific goal.
I think of it like a river. Right?
Okay.
The delta of a river, right? So if you guys
What's the delta of a river?
So it's when it, like, right before it meets the ocean, you see it, and it kind of like spider webs almost.
Okay.
Right? And so the concept of self-organization to me is almost like there's certain at some point the possibilities of that river are to go in all directions. But what happens is you put dams in front of certain certain parts of that river, and you prevent it from going in that direction.
Yeah.
That's like the most simple way to think about it.
You literally just took my exact door analogy from when you were outside the room and just replaced the word door with river.
Damn it.
So what is the...
I like river more because it's adaptable and flowing.
I like the door because most
See, the
people
door
don't know it. He didn't even know what a river delta was. No one knows what that is.
It's like the Nile River.
That's like the Nile River Delta, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
No, the door, you have to choose to go through one of them. So
Saying the
therefore-
river
Well, I was
just
saying
happens.
instead of choosing which door you open, you just knock out other doors and make it so those aren't options.
All right, touche.
So.
We're killing the listeners right now.
Yeah.
Good to have a Kyle.
Analogy. I was gonna say analogy game strong.
Yeah. So that's with the training stuff. Without going for another hour on this stuff, how can you apply this sort of this new adaptation theories and knowledge and understanding to what you put in your body as nutrition? If things aren't necessarily linear and how you're adapting, does that mean it's not as important to put, block periodization in terms of, how you scale up your macronutrients or your
Look,
eating?
So what Evan was just talking about is you want to control all the variables outside of your training so that training becomes the primary stress that your body's adapting to.
Mm-hmm.
What that means is that preventing under fueling or ensuring that you have, we'll just say it this way, ensuring that you have adequate fueling for the stress that you're applying with your training is the key to getting adaptations out of your training.
Right.
So to say that nutrition wouldn't matter, nutrition is one of those variables that you do have to control. Right. But I don't know if it necessarily needs to be controlled for an athlete to the degree that some people believe that it does. Like the idea that you have to hit this certain number of
every day
macros every day. Like that's an easy way to make sure that you're safe and that you're controlling that variable.
Yeah.
But it doesn't have to think that as an athlete that you have to get exactly 450 grams of carbohydrates and exactly 200. I mean, that's to assume that the labels on the packages and the app that you're using are all accurate in the first place, which they're not.
And that the soil that you got the fucking food from is the same too. Like that varies so widely. And I think that circles back to our needing control, which ultimately, like, if you really want to dial these things in, you need to relinquish that, because stressing about that shit, like I've literally seen athletes when we'd have them come on site, we're like, I have 8 grams of carbs left for the day and I need to hit that. I'm going to have 14 grains of rice because I need to get those 8 grabs, because if I underfuel on my macros, I'm going to be hypoglycemic tomorrow. And I'm like, what the fuck are you
14
talking
grains
about?
of rice.
That's one of the problems where just a little bit of knowledge is so fucking dangerous.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, 14 grains of rice. That's so good.
How many grams of carbohydrates is 14 grams of rice?
Couldn't tell you because I'm not tracking to that detail.
Wouldn't it depend on the soil? No.
Yeah, it seems like with the nutrition stuff that ultimately it's like a go by feel sort of process. Once you have established what it would be like to be very accurate. It's like, okay, if I was to like do this perfectly and say you do that for 1 or 2 days just to know what it's like, I need to be like in the ballpark of this thing and then adjust as the environment.
Well, yeah, and I think as you're starting to look at more research, like I do think having some general range that you want to fall on a given day, probably a beneficial thing, but within that, like, let your body dictate what it needs. If you need more carbs today, go for that. If you need more fat, go for that. If you need less or more calories. I think as time is going on, we're actually seeing that a lot of those strict adherence things probably have negative health benefits long term, like the need to have X amounts of like cyclic dextrin post-workout and shit like that. It's like, well, now that we know how the gut microbiome works, you might actually just be doing yourself a disservice by even consuming that period. And by overfeeding yourself to hit these macro numbers, well, what if you're creating like dysbiosis or like infections in your gut, and that's going to make it so you have less adaptation currency. So I think having those general ranges so you are creating some control and creating less variables, but within that, like, not being myopic or adherent to something just because it looks good on paper. And I think ultimately, like, you could apply that concept to anything within the training sphere.
Yeah, I always know a bad sign with any athlete is when you see them do a certain amount of training. What are you doing? They go, oh, it's written down. It has to be done. I go, that is a recipe for disaster. Like, you need to fix that attitude immediately.
I'm sure that anyone that is training, though, that is training to be an athlete, has gone through that at some point in their life.
Of course.
I know that I fell into that trap. It's on the paper, so it needs to be done.
Yeah.
It's like you have this assigned amount of work to you, and you have to do it. But that's part of the reason that the auto-regulation protocols work so damn well.
And like what you're saying is part of the like ridiculousness of like people being so adherent. Like I come from like the track and field world, and if you even look at how every coach in the sport prescribes, they have like specific numbers of sets that they'll use. Like I've seen people do like 6 sets, 8 sets, 10 sets. I've never seen someone do 9 sets of repeats or like 7. Because it doesn't look good on paper.
Yeah.
So it's like we could convince ourselves like this is like 6 sets, that's a really good training prescription, and 8 sets is really good, but like 7 sets doesn't make sense to give someone. And it's like,
so neurotic.
Yeah, it's like, what are you talking about? But if you do auto-regulated, like you might do 13 sets of back squats, or you might do like 4, or you might do 7.
But then what happens is you draw out the athlete's cognitive bias, right?
Yeah,
so
when they always finish
on like a 10 or a 12 or a 14, right? So it's like you tell them to do as many sets of back squats at 85%, rest 60 seconds. As many sets of 3 at 85%, rest 60 seconds between each one, right? And every time you get their feedback, it's like, I did 6 on week 1, on week 2, they did 10, on week 3, they did 12. So they're always ending. You're seeing their cognitive bias come out instead of your own, but at least they're listening to their body to some degree versus you as a coach trying to predict how many sets they will need in order to adapt, which, as I said earlier, is extremely egotistical.
Yeah, when I do it, it's more just me thinking to myself, how it feels around 2 or 3, one first set, second set, sometimes you're not quite warmed up properly or you just haven't kind of switched on yet. Usually around 3rd, 4th set, you've hit your groove, and I'm like, when it deviates too much from how this feels, I'm done.
That is a great way to do it.
Yeah, and then I just go off that, and I try not to think what set am I up to. Yeah, it's more like, when am I kind of over this?
Lachlan, that is the correct way to approach it. You've done it.
5 sets every time. Yeah, no, it's been much better, I find, and especially when you've got like a pretty hectic schedule, like Raf and I have. That's pretty, we don't always have 2 hours in the middle of the day to train. Like we like to think we do, but different meetings and stuff get in the way. Sometimes you come to a training session and you're just so burnt out from the day, or you're just so time poor that when there's not. You don't feel bad if you don't hit the 10 sets. When it's 4 to 15 or whatever it is, you could do 4 because just mentally you can't take doing more than 4, So I think even that, people just think, oh, well, I should do 10, They don't have to do 10.
So we have not just created auto-regulated strength training protocols, but we've also created auto-regulated energy system training protocols and auto-regulated Metcon or like sport-specific protocols for our sport,
I'd
for
take
CrossFit.
it farther, and I'd say, like, we didn't even just make these up. Like, they're actually tied to physiology. When I was training for the 500-meter row, like a year and a half ago.
What'd you get?
I think I did like a 120.8.
Oh,
I was like at 107 pounds body weight.
That is crazy.
I was like 0.7 seconds away from the world record in my weight class, and I found that out like 2-3 weeks later.
Had you known,
really good.
Had
I known, I probably wouldn't have hit it.
Yeah, I was gonna say you would have had hyperintention and fallen just short.
I literally created like an autoimmune issue from the training that I did for that. I'm not even kidding either, but don't do what I did. But leading up to that, months prior, I had popped on the Moxie monitor. Instead of doing the auto-regulation by feel, which this is initially how we created it, I did auto-regulation based on when does my physiology hit a breaking point. So on a given week, I did the exact same workout every single week for a little over 6 months just to see what would happen. On a given week, I'd go 4 sets, 28 sets, 11 sets, 39, 60 sets, 15. 0 trend whatsoever.
Right.
It based entirely off of what I did in the days prior, how I was feeling. And on paper, it fucking drove me crazy because I would look at my training log and it made no sense whatsoever. And I auto-regulated almost every training input that I did. And that's one of the things that led to me hitting that really good row time, was just letting my body hit right below its ceiling on every session, even though it made no sense on paper, but there was a structure to it. The workouts progressed at some level, but the amount of sets, how long I'd go on each interval, were all just determined on what I wanted my physiology to accomplish. Then with that, finding trends like, oh, when I hit this ceiling, this is what I'm feeling inside my body, and doing it with other people. that's how we created those autoregulated protocols. They weren't just things that we like pulled out of our ass, like, oh, this is cool.
Right, but you set the monitor to like a certain number, and as soon as it hit that number, you were like, I'm not.
I was consciously monitoring. I had on my laptop,
Right.
I would do my salt bike intervals, and I would literally like, we have these little desks that you could hook up to the squat rig.
Yeah.
And I'd have my laptop like 3 feet in front of me while I'm on the rower or the bike, and I'd be monitoring between sets how much blood volume I have in the muscle and how much oxygen saturation I have in the muscle.
Yeah.
So I would be consciously looking at it during my rest periods, and I would see when there would be like what I'd call like a physiological breaking point. I'd see like, oh, my respiratory system stopped reloading oxygen into my blood here, or my blood pressure can't regulate properly, or my mitochondria can't suck in oxygen anymore.
And then,
that constitutes like I'm right at the edge of a breaking point, and then I would just stop there for the day. And some days that would be 4 sets, some days it would be over 30.
We rebuilt our entire energy system course and our entire strength, I would say our entire energy system training model and our entire strength training model based on the research that Evan did there. Because what we found was that what he was discovering with the Moxie explained the things that we were seeing in training and the things that we were seeing in different types of athletes and the way that they respond to different types of training, whether it was endurance training, strength training, mixed work. We found that that explained it much better than the old models. And that is why we started creating new models and new courses to explain those models to people.
It feels like just even the longevity of an athlete would be like that's taken into consideration a lot more now.
We think so. We don't know yet because I mean, these models are a year and a half old.
Yeah, but from what we've seen, like I know for myself in the past, coming from that endurance background, I was always like the most extreme hard gainer with strength work, and I would do so much fucking volume, and it usually wouldn't. It would pay off for short periods, and I'd inevitably get injured because I would keep pushing past the point where, say I was doing 10 sets of 3 on back squat at 90%, I'd get through like 7 sets and I'd just like force the next 3 out. With these auto-regulated protocols where you're never pushing past that point of compensation, it allows you to do that week in and week out for weeks on end without ever getting to that breaking point of your body. And I think there is something to those principles. And again, we haven't been doing these for 5 to 10 years to see how it plays out.
I will also say I have not been able to successfully use them to peak a strength athlete for a strength test, if that makes sense.
Would I be the first one then?
No, I would not consider you a strength athlete.
Oh, okay.
What I'm talking about are people that are already very, like, mid 500 plus deadlift. I just haven't gotten all the way there yet.
I have used them on those athletes, and I have used them on some of my weightlifting athletes, and the way that I do peak them is a good bulk of their training is auto-regulated. But then within like anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks from when I want to peak them, that's when I switch from an auto-regulated approach to a mixture of like structure that would potentially look good on paper and like variable just based on how they're feeling. So instead of them auto-regulating the training, I kind of do the auto-regulating for them, but with peaking strength protocols and things that like everyone already knows, pretty classic protocols that you'd use to peak an athlete, and just shifting the focus from auto-regulation to that. And I found that to actually work pretty well. Same thing with energy system testing. Say we want them to hit the goal in 10 weeks. The first 7 will probably be pretty heavy auto-regulated, and then I'll take the reins and start to adjust their peaking for that.
Yeah, I was going to say it could remove the need a little bit more for deloading and peaking, like very specific deloading and peaking.
Yeah.
Which is cool. It's cool because it makes more sense to me, right? It's like you're going into a competition and there's so much changes from 1 week out of the open versus 30 weeks out of the open, like the mental state.
Absolutely.
Like they just sit there and their palms are just sweaty all day long, and they normally have dry palms because they're just thinking about it constantly, right? So yeah, there's so many factors at play. I think we'll stretch this too long, but unless you wanted to add any final things to your new models, I will ask Kyle the final 4 questions for the 4th time.
To be honest, I think we've barely even scratched the surface on the new models. But
we just kind of talk shit on the old model.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think there's enough for listeners, but we can always go again. The final 4 questions, Kyle. Again, 4th time. You've actually been. We were talking about this morning. You are the most popular My Muscle Project guest of all time. You've done the most episodes ever. You've overtaken Brent Fikowski.
You make me feel good.
Yeah. So it's Kyle, my coach, then Brent Fikowski, and then Third person was
It's got to be Max. He's done 2.
I think when Max does his third one, it will be Max. Yeah.
Hopefully.
That's the podium.
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good podium.
I'll take a top spot. At least I can win something, right?
Oh no, wait, Khan's done 3.
Yeah, constantly.
Khan's done 3.
Well, don't do another one with him so I can stay up there.
If we do a 2-parter with Max though, that'd be a lot. All right, Carl. So first question is the interview question. Who would you sit down and interview today if you could sit down and speak to them about anything and then answer openly and honestly?
Living or
living?
Living. All right. I think based on what I've read most recently, this is just temporal, not like I don't think I have anybody that's like this person that I'm like, oh man, I wish I could interview, but either Michael Pollan,
yes,
author, or the guy who wrote, and now I just had his name and it just slipped out of The Obstacle is the Way.
Ryan Holiday.
One of those two guys, just because those are the things that I've read most recently, and that I've read and were influential most recently.
What have you read from Michael Pollan?
I read his most recent book,
How to Change Your Mind?
How to Change Your Mind.
What did you think about that?
That was a very interesting book. It definitely opened my eyes to a whole set of things that I was not even aware of.
That is
Did
an understatement as to. Oh yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's probably one of the most. I think in 25, 30 years, people will look back at this book as something that, and all the media that he's doing around the book, like the podcast, Joe Rogan, Tim Ferriss, etc., as one of like the most influential shifts in like the culture of.
I hope that you are right.
Yeah.
And I hope that everything that's discussed in the book, and I hope the research pans out, and that it's not a flash in the pan. I hope that we now have solutions for mental health problems that we haven't had in the past. I hope that is something that pans out because let's face it, that depression, alcoholism, opiate addiction, anxiety, those are massive world problems that are way bigger than what we do in, coaching CrossFitters, and it's fun, but those are massive world problems. And I would love to see there be solutions for those people that are that are not within as he described it. I wouldn't describe it because I have no experience with the mental health system, but with our current broken mental health system.
There are no solutions that work to the extent and he's talked about this in the book, cancer treatment, right? Like chemotherapy, massive evolutions there.
I think back to my sister when she passed away in 2015 from cancer. And I think about just her last few weeks and how much that could have potentially been changed had she had access to the experiences that Michael talks about in the book. It would have been just a completely different experience for everyone involved in my family, not just for her, I think.
Yeah, I would absolutely love to sit down and interview Michael Pollan.
Get him on the podcast.
That would be amazing, yeah. Did we try and reach out to him? Was it him or? No, we tried to reach out to Matthew Walker, the sleep guy.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's who we tried to reach out to.
It might happen. He's on a tour.
Well, maybe now that I have mentioned him on this podcast, but I'm sure there's so many people that are on podcasts right now that are like, man, I read this book and it was really influential for me. Maybe now that I mentioned it and you guys throw it in there, that maybe you guys can get him on there. Who knows?
Who else Chris, was it you that just read the book, Michael Pollan's book? Were we talking about it?
Yeah, and Max as well.
Yeah. And
I
Max?
feel like everyone's
I think it's
reading
required.
that right now.
It's here. I think it's required reading for our training think tank.
Yeah.
Oddly, one was shipped here to me anonymously.
Michael Pollan's book?
Yes. It arrived. This was the strangest thing. Evan and I and Brandon
we were talking about it earlier that day too. Kyle pulled out his phone. He's like, "Oh, check out this book that I got on Kindle." And then it showed up in the mail. No one knows where it came from.
I didn't order Amazon. Amazon buys you shit you don't even order now, right?
Oh, well, if that's the case,
it
thank you.
automatically buys you stuff.
Wait, what do you mean?
No, it doesn't.
Yeah, it's like artificial intelligence. It knows what you're going to want.
No, it's not in my list. Not in my list.
Also, Amazon's not going to make you pay for shit if you don't.
Yeah, we'll do. That's why it's the biggest company now.
No, what are you talking about?
Amazon Prime Plus.
I was going to say, and Amazon's working through Whole Foods. I wake up checking out food that I'm like,
Evan, turn up your skepticism a little bit right now. That book had application from a coaching perspective, not taking not having athletes take psychedelics or anything like that, but just
tried it, didn't work.
Yeah, it didn't help. Just the idea that one of the things that can help people the most is getting them to, number one, get out of grooves of thinking that they're stuck in. Number two, expanding their self-concept beyond just themselves. Number 3, and I think this is the most important one, facing their fucking fears in training all the time. It was something I was already like going towards as a coach and as an athlete myself, but just getting people to be more honest about the movements and workouts and the pain. What are you afraid of in the sport? Pain? Well, guess what? This is a pain sport, so you're going to have to learn to fucking love that, right? So I think those are my big 3 takeaways. Reading that book through a coach's and training lens, those are my big takeaways. And then there's all the stuff, like I said, with my sister and people that in my family that have dealt with alcoholism and things like that. I just think it would be such an amazing tool if everything pans out.
I absolutely think it will. I think there's already forces at play, and there's so much money. I think I'm not sure. Didn't read the entire book. I read 80% of it, but
okay. You should finish the book. The last couple chapters are.
Did he talk about the funding of the guys that are doing the MDMA research with how they're being funded? Did he talk MAPS?
MAPS. Yeah.
Well, I don't know if you knew how MAPS is being funded, but they're being funded by Bitcoin entrepreneurs, which is essentially untraceable, uncorruptible levels of cash, like billions of dollars of money and funding that they can use.
I did recently read that Bitcoin itself is there's strong evidence that it's being manipulated.
Yeah, no, that's why the market's crashing. Yeah, but I think regardless, it means that the ways these things are being funded are not being corrupted, which is really interesting. Yeah. Okay, second question. What is is there a new routine that you've introduced this year you feel like is successful to every single day or required for the success of the day?
Yeah, I actually wake up way earlier than I have in the past. So I used to, and a lot of this was when my daughter was in school. I would, sleep until I had to get up to help her get ready for school. Right. Just recently, I've started waking up about an hour and a half earlier than I was traditionally, and I'm getting so much more done in that span of time. Somewhere along the way, I forgot that I was a morning person, that I woke up for swim practice at 5 a.m. from the time I was 14 until the time I was like 24. And I was so productive during that span of time, and I've just started doing that again. Maybe it was kind of like I had a conversation with Max, and he was talking about waking up earlier. I'm not exactly sure why, but I use some of the sleep principles from that I think you talked about it, but like moving it back 15 minutes, every couple days, and just got myself waking up quite a bit earlier. And I do it consistently, almost pretty much every day, and get a lot more done.
So what are you up to now?
What do you mean?
What time are you waking up now?
I get up at 5 on the dot. Where before I was getting up at like 6:40. I would stretch it to 6:40 if I could, like 6:45. Try and get to 7.
Did you use an alarm, or do you use a light alarm, or are you just naturally waking up now?
I used an alarm to start, and now I wake up naturally at 5 pretty much every single day. Today actually was a struggle to wake up.
Okay.
I was excited about doing the podcast today, or last night.
Okay.
So I got to bed a little bit later, and you know how it works.
Well, you've done a great job so far.
Evan has done a fantastic job.
Evan's a beast. Evan's first podcast was awesome. We actually, what's crazy? Raf made a joke. He goes, I think Evan's more popular than Travis, because we posted about it going out. And I checked the inbox of messages because people would just say, looking forward to the podcast, blah, blah. It's 4 more than Travis. So he's up 4 more comments or 4 more messages than Travis Mao.
Man, Travis is copying it. He missed the games and now he's losing to Evan in podcast popularity.
You got to watch out. Evan, we did call him the brain when he got here for at least a year. He's got a lot of knowledge.
Now you're the chosen one? Isn't that the new name?
The chosen one.
That's not the nickname Max gave me when I moved down here.
No.
And then we got Travis Mayer as Trevor the Feather. That's the new
Trevor
one.
the Feather?
One.
Yeah.
I like that.
Feather for short.
I like that a lot.
Yeah. Okay, so has there been... Well, I guess we've talked about this whole time. Yeah, well, the question is there anything recently you've changed your mind on that was a belief of yours? I feel like we covered... That was the entire podcast.
I talked to you guys about that, about this change in belief the last time I was on the podcast, just that I've completely shifted the way that I think about training. I would say that the biggest change has been taking a more athlete-centric approach to coaching people. And now, instead of just saying like, hey, I want to take a more athlete-centric approach, I have ways to actually go about doing that. I have systems for doing that. I'm not going to talk about the details of that yet, because at some point I think we will probably put that into some sort of educational material. But using the athlete to drive the content of their training, and me just being kind of like, I'm not even like the captain of the ship. I'm like maybe the crew that adjusts the sails or something like that. Like I have all the tools. I have the tools in the toolbox. They tell me where they want to go and what tools they need, and I just give them the tools. It's a very different approach than I've taken in the past.
Right.
Where I'm less important in the process.
Do you think that gives you less attachment as well, or allows you to be less emotional in the process?
No, I think it actually gives me more because I understand my athletes better. I know my athletes better. I'm more invested in their success because I identify more with them.
Okay. That's interesting. And then leaving the listeners with a quote and a book.
Well, the book is obvious. It's Michael Pollan's book, How to Change Your Mind. A quote, man, I'm so terrible with this. I have like a whole, where's my phone? I got like a whole thing of quotes that I've pulled out of there. Now, I don't know if I necessarily have a quote, but I also recently read Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and I extracted a lot of quotes. And basically, just the one that stands out to me, and it's not actually a full quote, but just remember that your meaning at any given time changes. And your meaning in 1 minute is different than another. And essentially, our only task is to deal with the set of circumstances that were given directly in front of us. And if you just do that on a daily basis, you're going to be in a much better place. And so if I can give 3 book recommendations, first would be Michael Pollan's book. Second would be The Obstacle is the Way. And the third would be Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl.
Nice.
Read all of them.
Nice. Did you want to chuck any books in there for us, Evan?
Evan will have good strange books for us.
He already threw some books in his podcast, but unless you
say, actually, like I had some time to think about these questions since our last podcast, because I'm like, I feel like I was fucking scrambling, making up
man,
some
you did
weird
good.
shit.
We gave you like 10 minutes notice.
But man, books. One that I like a lot is called Waking Up by Sam Harris, and it kind of goes along with Kyle's saying, kind of starting to see yourself from an outside perspective. I remember one of the things in the book, it's talking about consciousness. And it's saying like, oh, you walk in a room and you see the coffee cup and you think to yourself like, oh, the coffee cup's there, like my jacket's there. And then you realize you're like, who am I talking to right now? Like if your thoughts could be projected outside of your head, everyone would think you're schizophrenic. So that book just raised a lot of really interesting questions on perspective to me, or starting to understand that like if I was born in Kyle's home and had his similar genetics, I'd probably grow up to be exactly like Kyle. So when you don't agree with someone or you dislike someone, it's like, well, that would have been you had you been in those circumstances. So I think books along those lines were things that I tend to resonate more with, or things a little bit more along like philosophical lines.
Yeah, awesome. Sam Harris, he's got a podcast as well, right?
Yeah, and he actually just did an interview with Michael Pollan.
Did he?
Yeah, it was very interesting one.
I don't think it was as good as the Joe Rogan one.
No, it was not, but it was very interesting.
He's not Joe.
Yeah.
Sam's really into meditation. I think you can pick that up from his podcast. He relates everything back to his meditation practice.
But I think he had more experience than Joe, or he came at it with like a lot more. He had like more experience than Michael Pollan.
Yes.
With the stuff, so it was very interesting.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, gentlemen, thanks for the 2 hours. It was fantastic. And
I can't believe that was 2 hours.
Yeah. Thanks for everyone else for listening. And we'll talk about more details of what we're going to be doing with Training Think Tank over the next year in Max's podcast.
Cool.
All right. Thanks guys.